Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing part 3 and the final part of my San Jose Sharks Q&A, which is going to be discussing more the general questions that I received. And we start off immediately with a set of questions from NTQ0364, and I'll do a bit of rapid fire here since they aren't the most deep questions necessarily. The first of which is, which between Celebrini and Smith do I think is going to end up with the most amount of points this next season? And I do think that at their absolute maxed out potential, if they reach the absolute limit of what they are capable of as a prospect, that Smith might have the slightly higher offensive talent. But going into this next season, it is very likely that Celebrini will get significantly more ice time, like at least a couple more minutes per game than Smith, because I do think Celebrini will end up being a lock for the Sharks' top 6. He can play with players like Granlund, Eklund, Toffoli, Zetterlund on a consistent basis. Meanwhile, Smith is likely to more bounce around. Some time will be spent in the top 6, perhaps some time spent on the third line, and perhaps even some time spent with the San Jose Barracuda. So realistically, it should be Celebrini winning that point race, at least for this just upcoming season. After that, the question is who I believe will actually lead the entire Sharks team in terms of points. Last year, it was Mikael Granlund. He had a good bit more than anybody else. Coming into this season, I would say William Eklund is a pretty decent competitor to that. Someone who is also slightly more of a playmaker and is also someone who is expected to take a large step forward, not only because that's just the general development path, but he's also going to be playing with significantly better talent surrounding him. And so when it comes to between Eklund and Granlund, really the deciding factor is the fact that Granlund only has 1 year remaining on this contract. And you might think, well, what does that actually have to do with a points race? But it should be noted that if Granlund is actually doing well enough in this upcoming season to lead the Sharks in points, like he's got 50 points by the trade deadline, there probably will be a team that actually looks to acquire him for their playoff push as a rental with only that 1 year remaining on his contract. So in a world in which Granlund is actually leading in this area, he probably doesn't even finish the season for the San Jose Sharks. So it's essentially a win-win type of situation for Eklund. Either he's going to be leading in terms of points, or Granlund is going to be leading and then gets traded away, which leaves Eklund next. Technically, there could be a couple of other players. You never know how Celebrini might surprise, and then Tyler Toffoli, but I would say he's a bit more of a goal scorer. Celebrini's a bit more of a wild card playing in his first full season, so odds-on favorite, I would say, is Eklund at this point. Next question is, how many wins do I think the San Jose Sharks will get next season? Last year they had 19, which was really, really bad. They put up one of the worst, if not the worst season of the salary cap era of any team. This year it should be improved. Many people do still believe the Sharks to at the very least be in the bottom 5, if not still last place, but it shouldn't be as embarrassing, I would say. 47 points should hopefully be out of the question. I would say in terms of a point total or a win total, it would probably be in the mid to high 20s, something like 27, 28, which should give them a solid 60 points on the year to finish something like 3rd or 4th last in the NHL, depending on how the teams around them actually do, which would honestly be a notable improvement, I would say. The Sharks should hopefully just generally be a more competitive team on a nightly basis, which will be a bit more fun to watch. The next question is, do I think Mario Ferraro will actually be traded at the deadline this season? Ferraro's name has been involved in many trade rumors over this last year, kind of like what Askarov was doing with the Nashville Predators until he actually publicly demanded a trade. It seems more a situation where Mike Greer is letting the teams around the league know that they could inquire about Ferraro without actively shopping him around. At this point, I would imagine they keep Ferraro going into this next season, and the real only way I could see him actually being expendable is not only if Henry Thrun has a big step forward and is a solid top 4 defenseman on a consistent basis for the Sharks this next season, but also that Shakir Mukhamadullin steps into a bigger role this year and actually plays some pretty good hockey if he is given the chance. At that point, Ferraro will become slightly more expendable since he is also a left-handed defenseman, and perhaps if the right offer comes around at the deadline, they could move on from him, but otherwise I imagine he remains with the Sharks at least until this next offseason, where again his name will likely come back to the table. And then the final question here is, do I think Askarov will win the backup job? And I feel as though there's a pretty good chance he does. You know, coming here to San Jose, he wanted to be able to have a chance of playing in the NHL. And while we know Mike Greer did say that Askarov is open to playing with the Barracuda, I doubt he's all that open to playing with them for the entirety of the season. And the fact is that the 2 goalies standing in front of him aren't necessarily that impressive. Sure, Blackwood showed some pretty good things for the Sharks this past season, so he might have slight priority. But Vanacek is entirely new face on the block. He was traded for at the end of last season for Capo Kakinen, but he was injured, so he didn't play a single game for the San Jose Sharks. So there's no favor, there's no like here from the Sharks organization to get Vanacek games. So unless he actually absolutely outperforms at every turn Askarov throughout the training camp and preseason, it is likely Askarov will either start the season or be very quick to move up from the Barracuda to the main squad and get at least a decent amount of games. The next question is actually sort of a combination of two from both Ponyboy and Cousin It, who asked me, what do I think the Sharks lineup is going to look like next season? Well, it was about a month and a half ago where I did post two videos where I gave my predictions, some early predictions, but predictions nonetheless, of what the Sharks forward and defensive pairings could look like going into next year. And honestly, my opinion since then hasn't really shifted all that much, considering the Sharks haven't really changed their roster all that much since this point, but I'll quickly go through it now. Specifically, I was asked what I thought without Couture and then with Couture actually healthy. So without Couture, it's pretty much the same thing I had in that video. Celebrini with Eklund and Toffoli, then Granlund with Zetterlund and Smith, third line of Wenberg with Bordelot and Cunnin, and then a fourth line of Sturm with Dellandrea and Goodrow. This does feature Bordelot in the lineup. This is a player who I very much want to see actually get some NHL ice time. I don't know if it's actually going to happen. It's very possible he ends up on the outside looking in, but I do think he is worthy of the chance. Problem is that if Couture is healthy, it throws an even larger wrench into Bordelot's actual plans of being able to play. So with Couture healthy, I would say the lineup looks a bit more like Celebrini with Eklund and Toffoli, then a second line of Couture, probably with Granlund and Zetterlund, then a third line of Smith centering it with Wenberg and Cunning, and then probably a fourth line of Sturm with Dellandrea and Goodrow. In terms of the defensive pairings, I will say the top pairing will probably be something like Ferraro-Ceci, then the second pairing Wallman and then Benning, and then the third pairing of like Thrun and Ruda. This also does depend on how healthy Benning is. He didn't play for most of last year. If he's actually fully healthy, since he is a right-handed defenseman, I imagine he gets prioritized for ice time. If he is not healthy, the next step in is probably Shakir Mukhamadullin, at which point a left-handed defenseman will have to play the right side. I would imagine that would end up being either Ferraro or Wallman doing that, to not try and sort of put Thrun and Mukhamadullin into positions that they are not fully comfortable with, at which point it'll be something like Ferraro, Ceci, then Thrun, Ruda, then Mukhamadullin, Wallman. Next question comes from Monkey, who asks in a sort of three-parter some pretty interesting questions, one about the past, one about the present, and one about the future of the San Jose Sharks. And let us start with the one from the past, where he asks, what do I think Doug Wilson did wrong in not being able to actually ever get a Stanley Cup for the San Jose Sharks, and what can Mike Greer do to avoid the same mistakes? Now, this might actually be somewhat of a controversial opinion, but I don't actually believe that Doug Wilson had some massive failures that prevented the Sharks from ever actually winning a Stanley Cup. Most of his really egregious moves came near the last couple of years of his tenure as San Jose Sharks general manager, when he was trying to continue to scramble to make the playoffs with a roster that clearly wasn't playoff bound. But during the years in which the Sharks were competitive, Doug Wilson put together some really solid teams, and for many of those seasons, the Sharks either would finish the year as like a top 5, top 3, sometimes even the second best team in the entire league. It's just quite unfortunate that they were never quite the number one. Now, were there some small mistakes that Doug Wilson made? Oh, absolutely. You know, some years in which maybe the team didn't have enough physicality, they didn't have enough defensive depth, they didn't have enough speed. These types of errors where there was just like a small issue with a Sharks roster, but what general manager from around the league can truly say that they haven't made some small mistakes? And sometimes your hands can be a little bit tied by the salary cap and things of that nature. So, you know, Doug Wilson, he put together some really solid teams, but what really held the San Jose Sharks back were just a couple of factors. First of all, you know, during a lot of their really good seasons, there was always one or two teams that were just a step above the Sharks. For instance, from 2010 to 2015, the Chicago Blackhawks and the Los Angeles Kings dominated the league, winning 5 of the total 6 Stanley Cups awarded during that time. The one year that they didn't win it was won by the Boston Bruins in 2011, but that season the Sharks lost to a Vancouver Canucks team that were insanely stacked and will probably go down as one of the best teams ever to not win a Stanley Cup. But in other years, 2010 they dropped to the Blackhawks, 2013 and 2014 2014 they dropped to the Kings, it was a situation where indeed the Sharks were like the fourth, the third, maybe even the second best team in the league that year, but there was always the one team above them. But sometimes as well, you could also just get a little bit unlucky, and that stems primarily from injuries. I look back at the 2019 season, the last year that the Sharks actually made the playoffs. They had an incredible team on paper. They had the talent, they had the depth, they had the defense, they had a lot of really, really good aspects. They didn't really have the goaltending because Martin Jones fell off a cliff, which was extremely unfortunate, but they still could have moved past that in the playoffs if not for the massive amount of injuries that they sustained, primarily to Erik Karlsson, who had to play the entirety of those playoffs through an injury. When he was fully healthy for the Sharks that year, he was absolutely incredible, but during the playoffs he was unfortunately essentially playing at like half power. And then when you also consider Pavelski having gone down with an injury, Hurdle having gone down with an injury, they just didn't have the juice to fully get it done against the St. Louis Blues, especially a team that was so physical and downright sometimes dirty as well, like St. Louis in the Western Conference Finals that year. That was a year where they could have very well won a Stanley Cup, but some unfortunate injuries just held them back. So indeed, were there mistakes for Doug Wilson during this time? Absolutely. But did he do some really solid things, put together some really, really good teams? I think that is the case as well. And there are probably more than half of NHL fan bases who would trade their last 20 years for the last 20 years that we got to experience as San Jose Sharks fans. If there is one thing that I will say Mike Greer is doing a bit better than Doug Wilson, is actually having acquired a hopefully consistent goaltender. During the 2010s, that was a major issue for the San Jose Sharks. During the first half of the 2010s, Antti Niemi, who was quite good at times, but lacked the consistency, and multiple times through the playoffs, he would kind of fall off a cliff a bit. Meanwhile, in the latter half of the 2010s, it was Martin Jones who was really good for 3 years, in particular 2016, where he led the San Jose Sharks to a Stanley Cup Finals. He was one of the only reasons that they actually had a chance in that final round against the Penguins. But after those 3 years, he also completely fell off a cliff. And so the Sharks, they didn't never actually have that consistent goaltender, at least since Evgeny Nabokov back in the 2000s. Askarov is the type of player who could offer that for like a decade plus. So that's a smart move by Mike Greer and could be the difference maker for the Sharks once they actually get back into a playoff position. The more present question now is, who do I think could have a breakout year like we saw Fabian Zetterlund have last season? Now, Zetterlund was a bit of an exception, I would say, where it's a pretty of an odd case because he was actually quite good with the New Jersey Devils as a rookie prior to getting traded to the Sharks, but then when he arrived in San Jose, he was downright awful, which meant that coming into this past season, many people pegged him as like a third or perhaps even a fourth liner. And so when he suddenly was really, really good, it caught a lot of people by surprise, but technically he always sort of had it in him, so to speak. It should also be noted that because the Sharks were relatively weak at forward this past season, it was not all that difficult to move up as a fourth liner to being suddenly a number one player. But for this upcoming season, things are going to be a lot more tight. There is going to be a lot more names that will likely have these spots locked down. And so to actually find a player who I think is going to be like a fourth liner who then could suddenly become a first liner for the Sharks is a lot more difficult. Really, the only candidates would be Ty Dellandrea, Carl Grundstrom, maybe Thomas Bordeleau. They sort of have chances, but unlike with Zetterlund, where it was a slight possibility because of past experience with the New Jersey Devils, with those three other players, it would seem pretty much out of the question. So honestly, I don't think players will have a Zetterlund type of breakout year, but if we consider just sort of like a player who has a large jump in point totals, that could happen with players like William Eklund, for instance. Honestly, maybe that's even slightly expected for him. And then the future-related question is, do I think that the San Jose Sharks should try to go for a big-name free agent? Kind of like what the Maple Leafs did a few years ago with John Tavares, or what the Rangers did a couple of years ago with Artemi Panarin. And honestly, this is on kind of a case-by-case basis. It is hard to say now because you never really know until you're actually faced with that choice. Currently, the San Jose Sharks have many entry-level contracts on their hands. Eklund, and now starting with Celebrini and Smith, and then over the next couple of years, they'll have a few more rookies step into place who also have entry-level deals. And so the financials of the San Jose Sharks 3 to 4 years down the line are completely unknown. So it's hard to say that they should sign some big name free agent for like $12 million right here, right now. On top of that, it's not all that common for a big $10+ million free agent to actually reach free agency. Sure, it happened with Tavares and Panarin, but besides those two, not all that often. Gensel, I guess, this past season was sort of a candidate there. And so I could sit here and say, well, Draisaitl's contract is running up. They could sign him, but it's likely he comes back with the Oilers. McDavid's contract is almost up. Maybe the Sharks could sign him, but he'll probably end up back with the Oilers as well. And so it's a situation that perhaps when the Sharks are actually faced with it in a couple of years' time, that's when I can make the call. But at this point, it's a bit too early for that. The next question comes from Matt Blom, who asks me what I would actually grade Mike Greer's performance as Sharks general manager through the first couple of years of this rebuild. Now, Greer has made a lot of very positive moves for the San Jose Sharks. Being able to get rid of a lot of these really big contracts and actually get good value back for them was a nice bit of work. The Timo Meier trade looked underwhelming on paper, but is starting to look really good for the Sharks with how Zetterlund has panned out and the first round pick ending up being Quinton Musty. The Erik Karlsson trade might have not looked great at the time based on the small amount of retention that the Sharks actually wanted to achieve, but because the Penguins ended up missing the playoffs, the Sharks ended up with the 14th overall pick, which is quite good. The Tomas Hertl trade, which eventually led to the acquisition of Yaroslav Askarov, was also a nice piece of couple of trades there for Greer. And then probably his best move, even if it was slightly low-key, was actually moving up in the draft the day before the draft from 14th to 11th overall, something that they probably would not have been able to do had Greer actually waited until that first round actually rolled around. But the fact that he was able to do it before, he sensed perhaps that one of those big name defensemen would still be available at 11, and as such he makes the move early, I thought was really, really smart. At the same time, there were also a bit of suspect moves from Mike Greer. The Brent Burns trade is probably the worst move that he has made in terms of a trade deal the entire time as Sharks general manager. The re-signing of Luke Cunnin, I'm not a big fan of. Picking up a Barclay Goodrow off of waivers really doesn't make much sense at all. So there were some downturns as well, but more often than not, I would say it was quite positive for Greer. However, I do also want to mention that these first couple of years of this Sharks rebuild, I won't say are the easier parts, but they're definitely a lot less difficult to navigate. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to have put together a really bad team, have them lose a bunch of games, get the best possible draft lottery odds, win the draft lottery, and then take the obvious de facto number one overall pick in the draft, right? That could be done by most people, most general managers. Really what I'm going to be watching from Mike Greer is over these next couple of seasons when he starts to navigate, whereas Sharks, they have all of these assets, but they're still trying to fill in the few holes that they might still have, as well as how he handles the contract situation for the Sharks. We haven't seen Greer really have to deal with that all that much. Sure, he signed a few deals, really small ones for some of the Sharks' younger players, and then of course a couple of free agent signings this past season of Toffoli and Wenberg, but those were more so like short-term deals just to reach the salary floor. When it comes to actually giving the longer-term deals to players like Eklund, like Smith, like Celebrini, we're going to see the chops of Mike Greer as a general manager in the NHL. So currently, the first couple of years I think have gone really, really well, but it remains to be seen how he's actually able to do when it gets a bit more difficult. But currently, I'll give him about an A-, I would say. The next question comes from FilipinoFwn, who asks, how many years do I think it'll take until the Sharks get to compete again? And it really depends on how you view the word compete. If you are saying compete as in competing for a Stanley Cup, it's likely still a ways away. I would say at least a minimum of 5 years before the Sharks are even thinking about being like that really, really competitive team, and probably more so in like that 6 to 7 range, depending. However, if your definition of compete is actually just being able to make the playoffs, well, that actually might come a bit sooner. Probably not this year. That would be very unlikely. Likely not the next year either, but I would say 26, 27, so in a couple of years from now, might actually be a playoff season for the San Jose Sharks if development of these young players actually continues to go well and Mike Greer ends up playing his cards right. So it might actually come a bit sooner than we might think. And then the final question of the day of the Q&A comes from Michael Molasses, and this is a really interesting one, as he asked me, would I rather the San Jose Sharks repeat the painful season that they had last year, Or would I rather them make the playoffs but end up getting swept in the first round, kind of like what happened to the Washington Capitals this past season? Now, I will have to, in terms of some clarification, if we are saying that it is pretty much an exact repeat of last year, as in the Sharks, they finish in last place, they are absolutely terrible, it's a super depressing season, they're giving up, 10 plus goals in multiple games in the year, 10 plus losing streaks as well throughout the season, and it's just super demotivating, then I would have to choose the playoff appearance over that. I think it would be extremely damaging to the early careers of players like Smith, like Celebrini, and continuing to damage players like Eklund and Zetterlund if the Sharks have yet another season where they are just completely hopeless and lost. I think that would not be a good thing, and even though it would still lead to like a top 3, perhaps even a number 1 overall pick, which might be in a perfect world an actual good thing, once you actually consider the players having to go through it, it just doesn't really seem like it would be good for San Jose at all. And so playoffs, that would actually be a decent experience for the Sharks. There will be some excitement in the air around the team, even if it ends up with them getting like a 18th overall pick in the draft. However, if instead by painful season repeating we mean another season where the Sharks are a basement dweller, I would probably choose the basement dweller as long as, again, it's not as bad as last year. If they end up with, 60-ish points, they finish 3rd last in the league, but they're actually more competitive on a night-to-night basis, I do think that is better for them than just randomly making the playoffs and bowing out immediately. In either case, though, it does also somewhat depend on how the Vegas Golden Knights do. If the Golden Knights actually end up with a top 10 pick in the draft, I will take the Sharks making the playoffs, because then they can send their own first-round pick to Nashville and still get a top 10 from Vegas. But in the most likely case where that doesn't actually occur, as long as there's going to be a basement dweller but still pretty decent, I would take them over making the playoffs. But if it's a repeat of last year, definitely the playoffs 10 times out of 10. But that will do it for this Q&A. I thought it was a very interesting video idea, and if you guys actually have liked it, then leave in the comments, and perhaps we can make this a semi-reoccurring thing, maybe like once or twice a year, depending. Class dismissed.